Microphones in 3.
Take what? I'm so loud. You probably don't even need a mic, really. Here. Oh, there we are. Here we are. No, I don't have to yell. Hello, I'm Randy Kleiner, the co-founder and CEO of SeriesFest, and welcome to Season 8, Day 2. We are here, back in person. Very excited. First of all, thank you to our partners here at Denver Film. We're in the C Film Center, an incredible, 3-theater, beautiful state-of-the-art. They become our family over the next few days, from the projectionists to the front of house staff. Thank you so much to Denver Film. Thank you to the SeriesFest staff and to all of our volunteers who donate their time. We could not put on the festival if it wasn't for hundreds of volunteers that come and help here, so I just want to give a big thank you to them. And for this special panel, just a quick thanks to the Media and Tech Collective for supporting this program. You are here for the True Crime Adaptation Panel. I don't know how many, I assume you're all here because you're binging true crime like I am. It's so addicting. And there's the stories I know how they end, and then there's the ones that I don't, and I have to really try hard not to look up what happens. I try to be really vigilant about it. I don't always win out, but I try. But what I think is so incredible, and thank you to Universal Studio Group for bringing this true crime panel to life and bringing this idea to us. I'm pretty sure they were like, we want to do a true crime. I was like, yes! Very quickly, so thank you for making this happen. But I think what's so incredible about this panel is you're going to sit down with 4 incredible creator showrunners who are bringing some of the best true crime stories to life. Some that are about to air, some that have aired. So it'll be a really interesting conversation. But I always find it fascinating, the kind of marriage between being truthful to the story and to entertainment, and how that marriage kind of exists, and where they bend the rules, and I'm excited to kind of dig right in and get into it. I'm very excited to introduce our moderator, who has participated with us virtually, and I just had the pleasure of meeting her for the first time in person. Love that we're back in person. So please welcome the Culture Trends editor of NBC News, Saba Hamidi.
Hi, everyone. We have a great panel, as you already heard. I'm really excited to introduce everyone on it and to be here. So thanks for having me. Okay, we'll start with Patrick McManus, the showrunner of Dr. Death and co-showrunner of The Girl from Plainville.
The Korean
And then we have Nick Antosca, the showrunner of A Friend of the Family and executive producer of Candy. And then we have Robin Veith, showrunner and co-creator of Candy. And last but not least, Robbie Pickering, creator and showrunner and executive producer of Gaslit. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
I was joking earlier with the SeriesFest people that I ended up writing all my questions out, and they kind of look like true crime notes. So please excuse any.
We can help translate those for you.
Yeah.
Come on over.
Sorry.
Ooh.
Don't want that to happen.
No, that's all right.
All right. Okay, I guess I want to start off with 2022 has already been one of the most true crime saturated years. With shows and movies and docs, and also a broader sense of what true crime is. I mean, if you want to, put Dropout and Inventing Anna and stuff like that, because those didn't involve murder, but they were a true crime. But the trend shows no sign of stopping anytime soon. So I wanted to start off by asking you all, why do you think this genre is so popular? And across formats, shows, movies, podcasts, like people can't get enough, myself included. Go ahead if you want to start, Patrick.
Oh, sure. Hi, everybody. How you doing? I feel like I could definitely talk like that. Everyone who knows me well knows that I talk too loudly. Look, I'm sure that my fellow panelists will have a smarter answer than I do on this. I think that there is, whether you want to put true crime in a little box for a second, just talk about the fact that people are always trying to understand elements, and I'm putting in big quotes, of evil, right? Understanding why people do what they do when they do bad things. There's a rubbernecking nature to mankind that's very natural. What I'm about to say, I don't know if it's actually true or not, and so please understand that I'm not very smart. But I had read somewhere in a fortune cookie or something, that that the reason that people have nightmares is like a very it goes back in evolution to a time of trying to work through the horrors of the world and figure out how you could survive that. And I've sort of always tied those two together in a weird way. I started reading Stephen King at way too early of an age, and I've been fascinated with the human side of quote unquote evil. And I think that that's just what people have always found fascinating in cinema and in television. We're just now finding another avenue to be able to tell those stories, those sort of horror stories in a different way. That's
Yeah, that.
Is it true about the nightmare thing? I don't know.
I don't know.
Okay,
I mean,
cool. Somebody Google that.
Nightmares to me are just writing fuel, so I don't know how they work. But I mean, to me, I think true crime has there's the lowbrow aspect and the highbrow aspect, and the lowbrow is people like rubbernecking. You know, there's a kind of gossip and fascination element, but at the same time, you know, it allows you to take a look at and ask questions about human nature. And so you can bring people in with that kind of base fascination, and then you get to explore questions like, what was somebody's interior life like when they were experiencing this thing that is, you know, an easy tabloid headline? And that to me is, you know, a real opportunity.
I've been told that the largest audience for true crime is women, and it certainly stands that test amongst my friends and everything. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the reason why we are drawn to it is because, at least my generation, and maybe it's changing now, was raised to be on constant alert. You know, you go everywhere with your keys in your hand and everything, so I just would devour all of these stories and be like, I'm not gonna fall for that one. You know, it's just like more, you know, tools in your toolkit. You know, like I will never get life insurance. That's why they kill you. You know. But yeah, I think it's like, and also this sort of like need to feel like, wow, I've got my shit together. You know, like that's just sort of my seeking suspicion.
You know, my show is about political true crime. It's about Watergate. So
Nobody knows what that is.
nobody knows. Yeah, it's not like a murder show, although things get, nobody gets murdered, but, you know, America kind of.
Just a career.
Yeah. But I think, you know, it's always a little thrill where you see a serial killer or somebody doing something horrible and you're like, yeah, that's terrible. And then in the back of your head, you're like, yeah, I know. Yeah, I can see that. And I think that's, you know, when I'm writing about crime, I'm not really interested in writing about people as... I don't really like writing crazy people because I don't really relate to, like, psychotic people. But I like writing exaggerations of myself in them and kind of exploring the more distasteful sides of myself and the more embarrassing, shameful sides of myself. So I think when I listen to true crime and I watch true crime stuff, I kind of get a secret thrill out of seeing myself in little aspects of, say, Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't know.
That's a good quote. For anybody out here?
That's the headline for this panel.
Don't take it out of context. Those are all such thoughtful responses. We can leave now, right? No, just kidding. And you all touched on this a little bit briefly, and I was chatting with some of you about it before, but I am curious what your first experience with true crime was. For me, I was a kid, but the O.J. Simpson stuff stands out as something that, like, the first time I ever, like, was like, what is this? And a parent had to explain. But what was your first experience with, like, you know, being captivated by these headlines even prior to becoming showrunners yourselves? And how did you remain invested or get back into it for these respective projects?
I mean, my first experience with true crime was not headlines. It was, I was a little kid in New Orleans, which was, I don't know if it was the murder capital of the country but it was like
Hey, I'm from Baltimore.
a dangerous.
He's up there.
Yeah, right. But hearing stories about people being murdered in my neighborhood, or one of my mom's friends was murdered, and so I had a real fascination and terror of crime and the threats that were out there from being a very little kid. Then when I got older, I was, of course, we all remember O.J. I read Helter Skelter pretty young, and then I read it again, 5 or 10 years later. And you hear people talk about I read, The Catcher in the Rye, and I read it every 5 or 10 years, and it was a different book. For me, that was like Helter Skelter. Yeah.
So you're meant to be creating in this genre.
I'm maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I was around for the OJ trial. I had just finished my first year in college and went home to visit for the summer, and all of my friends from college were calling me because they were literally standing on the bridge above the tent, and it was just the week that I was getting. I was so bummed that I missed it. So that was sort of probably my first exposure. But the one that hooked me, that just made me a lifer, was The Staircase. The first time I saw that, just the way that it just turned every 5 minutes. And after that, I was just you can do anything.
That's back, by the way. There's another. It's you can get your fix again.
I know. I that's on my list. I haven't watched it.
I was really obsessed with Jimmy Swaggart when I was a kid, and just seeing this guy caught in such a horrible. My parents were very evangelical, and I was never that into murders. I was just into
Terrible people.
Terrible people getting caught. I remember when Ted Haggard got caught. Does anybody who knows who Ted Haggard is? I remember I was very interested in not only him getting caught, but the aftermath. There was this documentary that they made about him, about how he was shunned from his church, and he had to move away with his family. It's just this miserable family, and kind of this guy who's been, who was the leader of something horrible, who is now, a victim of that thing. I think I was always attracted to that a lot, and kind of political malfeasance and religious hypocrites. I remember my pastor at my church used to make a joke about Bill Clinton every morning, or every Sunday morning. He'd start the sermon with some joke about Bill Clinton, how horrible he was morally. And funny story, that pastor was fucking his secretary for 2 years and got caught.
That's about right.
So I was, when I heard that, I was like, oh boy, that's awesome. I got to write about that. Something about that. So yeah.
It's always the ones that crow the loudest, isn't it? Fucking asshole. I sort of alluded to it in my last answer that my mom worked a whole bunch of jobs when she was raising us. She was a single mom, and so she never had the opportunity to pick us up after school. We just made our own way home, and of course uphill both ways in the snow. And but she got called in. There's a Sister Mary Patricia, that's a real name, called her in and said, you have to come in right now. My mom comes in. She says, do you know what your son was reading at lunch? It's in the 5th grade. And my mom goes, well, unless I'm mistaken, it's Stephen King's Misery, right? So I was reading Stephen King at a really young age because my mom encouraged that. So Stephen King was definitely my first foray into the more complicated, dark side of man. I still contend that he paints characters better than any novelist out there, but I'm sure they can educate me more. I will say that as it relates to specifically what your question is, I remember being very young, and I don't remember how old I was, but watching the Ted Bundy interview before he was executed, and was just, I don't even think I knew what Ted Bundy had done. I know that he'd killed a bunch of people, but I just found that it's still imprinted in my head, like so fascinating. He was so eloquent. He was so charming, and he was about to be executed. And I still to this day remember being like, how did that guy do? They said he killed a whole bunch of people. How'd that guy kill a bunch of people? And that, I guess, goes to what we're all sort of touching on, which is that you don't ever want in my opinion, to paint a picture of a quote unquote villain who only wears a black hat. You want that complicated villain that there's a deeper story to unravel. And so that's my first memory of true crime, I guess.
Well, now that you've all talked about your first memories of it, I'm going to take you to your more recent ones. As showrunners, how do you all decide what stories you do want to adapt, and can you talk me through a little bit about what the process is like once you identify something, and specifically how you decide, how you want to tell it? Because a lot of your projects have also had documentaries or podcasts like Slow Burn and whatnot. So I would love to hear more about what goes into the decision and how you want to bring it to life. Your own way. Yeah, we can start with Rob.
Well, I think what Patrick said about Stephen King, I mean, I read a lot of Stephen King as a kid too, and I think I always really connected with, even when I'm reading The Shining as a kid, there's some emotional thing he's exploring about himself, right? And how, his frustration with being a writer and the frustration of failure and, how that, and toxic masculinity. And when I hear, the worst thing somebody can say to me a lot of times is like my agent or something. It's like, have you heard this? You should do this story. It's so weird what happened. You'll never believe what happened. And it feels very shallow to me because there's a lot of weird shit going on all the time. But like, I need to see something in it that I want to explore about us. Or, with Slow Burn, it was really, I've always written conservative women because I think they're punks, but they're punk rock, but like for fascism, and like there's something, I grew up with them and they're awesome, and why I had always wanted to do something about the culture of Nixon because, we're going through a period where you see all these people throwing themselves under the bus for Donald Trump, and doing things for a president, being complicit in horrible things for a president that they know is not loyal and will throw him under the bus the second he gets a chance. And there was some interesting exploration of complicity in that and what drives us to be complicit in terrible things. And so, and I asked that of the writers in the room to really relate to the material on that level. Our first question to the writers in the room when we hired them was name a quality of one of the characters you see in yourself, and it cannot be a good quality. It has to be a quality that you're embarrassed to tell me about, that you're ashamed of, that you don't want to tell. Because to me, I think a lot of what a great writer's room is just a bunch of people sharing like mundane things from their life that they're really embarrassed of, and the embarrassing everyday things that they go through. And you were talking about Ted Bundy. I saw. I'm not like obsessed with Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm just bringing this up because it made me think of something. Jeffrey Dahmer, the way he talked about killing people, it was the opposite, right? It was like he was so ashamed of it, like he didn't want to talk. It was so vulnerable, and so you kind of like him.
Wait, was he? I thought he got killed by somebody in prison because he was joking about how he killed people, and he was like showing them with.
I'm sure he did, but in all the interviews, he's like I haven't watched it a lot, but one of the things I related to was like he's very like conflicted about it. Like there's some side of him that knows he has these compulsions and is ashamed of it, or I don't know, and there's something relatable in that to me. Whereas the Ted Bundy thing, I'm just like, wow, how impenetrable. That's how I feel about Donald Trump. It's like I would never want to write Donald Trump because I can't relate to a person who's just a shell. Like I don't really know how I'd be able to square that with my own life. But when I'm writing John Dean or John Mitchell or here's Rudy Giuliani or something like that. Rudy Giuliani is just a guy who is chasing a version of what he was 20 years ago and is kind of trapped in that cycle and kind of a slave to it. To me, I feel like I've experienced that at certain points in my life. So, I feel like, anyways, I feel like any good writer's room, whether it's been a true crime room or a comedy room. My first room was Search Party, which is a show on HBO Max now, and it was all people's worst experiences in life, everyday experiences, and I think that's what makes characters real,
Just curious, was that the first day in the writer's room that you asked them to share the trait that they shared?
That was at their interviews. and if they couldn't, well, look, if somebody can't tell you what they're embarrassed of, where they farted, then you don't want them in the room,
It's a good life.
I could have been in your room easy with that question. If that's the bar, I got that one, for sure.
Anyone else want to? Robin?
Sure. So with Candy, Nick and I actually go way back, and we had just finished working on the act together. And Nick called me one day and said, hey, you should check out this story of Candy Montgomery, see if it's something you'd be interested in. And I did some research, and I was just like, wow, this is like a Mad Men axe murder. I'm in. It was in the fall of 2019 where Me Too was sort of like in full steam, and I just felt like a story of released feminine rage was feeling very identifiable, because in the wake of Me Too, I felt like women were able to finally say yes. This is very frustrating, and it feels very good to talk about this now because we've been told don't talk about it your whole life, chin up, soldier on, and we're just not going to do that anymore. So there was something in this rage that happened with these women in the 80s that felt very identifiable to me. And then we got into 2020, and with everybody locked in their houses, I was like, okay, now this story's universal. Now everybody can understand, just being pent up and asked to do all these things, for the good of society. And of course, we're gonna do it. Of course, we're gonna do it. Happy to do it and everything. But you asked me to do one more goddamn thing, and I swear to God, I thought that was a really relatable emotion for everybody now. And it's just, Nick and I had a lot of conversations of, what was the environment that made this insane event happen? What led up to it? Who was the person whose brain, was firing on this? And it just became a very interesting character study that, there's something in me, I've been in meetings where I'll get a note and I'm like, yeah, I could slam your head in the table 41 times now, not break sweat, no problem. I get it, I get why she did it. And I'm just like, God, what? Sure, we'll look into that. It's just, it just makes you wonder, it makes you feel like you're doing okay in that, I don't think I'm ever gonna cross that line, and the fact that people do just has a weird way of centering.
What if you are an axe murderer and this is your new way of tricking us all?
Don't follow me down an alley.
They're gonna play clips of it.
What is your nickname? Silent Rage in the Silent Fury?
Oh, I had a nickname at one point, which we were giving each other hobo names, and mine was Hidden Fury. I have a cross stitch framed in my office.
I haven't really sought out true crime stories to tell. It's only when there's a story that I can't stop thinking about that I want to work on. I think a lot of true crime things that are out there, and once you do one, you'll get sent a lot of them. It's like detectives and investigating a mystery or whatever, and it's just that's never been creatively kind of intriguing to me. But the stories where you're just like, how did that happen? How could that possibly have happened? But it did happen, so I want to understand how it could have happened, and also I want to understand what it felt like to live it as it was happening. And that's why stories like Candy, like The Act, like Friend of the Family, which is the show we're doing about the Broberg family story, which was abducted in plain sight. It's coming out later this year. they all are about kind of core, complicated character relationships, and they all take place over a long period of time where you can sort of live in the story and in the world and kind of marinate in the psychology. And those are the stories that kind of have stayed with me and made me want to tell them. And in almost every case, it's been like, that's not a TV show. You couldn't watch. Why would anybody want to watch like 8 hours of medical child abuse? No one is going to want to watch that. And then you start thinking about what it was like to live in this house, what the dynamic between these people was, and the story kind of starts to come together. And those are the cases where I, felt like it was going to be really meaningful to pursue the story.
Well said. So, yeah, there you go.
Well, now I'm moving on to every journalist's favorite, research. And I know all of you obviously had to do a lot of research in your writers' rooms when putting these shows together. I know Patrick at South by mentioned, I believe the texts came as you guys were already writing, right? Like the Michelle Carter and...
We actually had access to those texts, meaning Liz Hanna, who was the co-creator and the co-showrunner of it. We had that from the get-go, so that so that was definitely beneficial. And I'm now segueing out of true crime. My next two shows are not true crime, and one of them is a true story, but one of them is pure fiction, and I'm missing all of that material. Yeah, I gotta tell you, I'm like, I have to make this shit up? Really? Where's that file that I can just go to and create story from? And it really, look, for both Dr. Death and Girl from Plainville, it was extraordinary. Like, with Dr. Death, obviously all we really had were court transcripts and testimonies and interviews and things like that. Plainville was a whole other thing, which was just extraordinary. I mean, the opportunity to be able to have thousands and thousands of text messages over years from Michelle Carter is, and I don't want to diminish it or seem optimistic, opportunistic about it, but it really made the job of crafting this character easier. I mean, we had an insight into who she was as a young woman. We had insight into who she was with her family, like how she spoke about her family. We had obviously insight into hers and Conrad's relationship that was just thousands of messages themselves. And that enables you to, I wouldn't say easily, because you have to go through thousands of text messages and figure out how you're going to craft a story from that, but it absolutely allows you to get to your end goal quicker, which is one of the things that I think we're all sort of saying, which is that you really do want to paint a full picture of these people, and to have their words in black and white over multiple years, it just gives it a responsibility to be able to get it right, but an opportunity to be able to really dig in and paint that three-dimensional portrait that, at least as it relates to Girl from Plainville, readers of the news stories didn't have. She was a headline, and only a headline. And I had the exact same reaction when I first delved into the story, which was that she's just a murderous black widow. And then you start to dig in and you realize that's just not what she was. So the research, I wish I had some research on my next one. I really do.
How many hours did it take to sift through the text?
I mean, I got the text messages for the first time in September of 2019. Yeah, that's right. September of 2019. I stopped reading text messages in December of 2021, just before we wrapped, because you're doing rewrites, and up to the last minute you're doing rewrites, and when Liz and I wrote the finale, the one half of the finale I'm not going to get into because I would like you to just watch it and hopefully be surprised. The other half is Conrad's last day on Earth. And so we were writing that, and we were producing that, and we were diving into those texts on the day, like on our phones, just talking to Elle and talking to Colton, and look, I mean, I don't know why I'm getting emotional about this, but it's kind of one of the reasons I'm also looking forward to doing fiction for a second. It does. Yeah, it's been 3.5 years of Dr. Death and Girl from Plainville, and it does take a toll, even if you try to be an emotionless ass like me. It digs in and finds the emotion. That in particular was a really tough show.
And Robin and Nick, I think I read that you guys used the court transcripts and also notes from the doctor. Did you guys interview, talk me through a little bit for Candy?
Yeah, we had as our chief consultants Jim Atkinson and John Bloom, who
Right, the
were
journalists.
the journalists who covered the story from the beginning, and they actually spent time in these people's homes and spent numerous hours with all the key players except for Betty, of course. And so it was a lot of speaking with Jim, and we also spoke to Steve Defabaugh, who was the sort of lead investigator, deputy on the scene. And we spoke to Robert Udishin, who was one of Candy's attorneys. And it's just fascinating that 40 years later, without emails, without texts or anything, this is a story that's based on one woman's, point of view of how to tell it. There's no electronic evidence, there's no photographic evidence or anything. But 40 years later, all of these people are still deeply entrenched in their opinion of what they think happened. And part of the fun, if we can call it that, of interviewing these people is you can ask one little question and see somebody cock their head, they hadn't thought of that before. And that was sort of the really interesting part, to just keep digging. And just to second what Patrick was saying, he and I have talked about this before, when you're doing these shows based on real people, there is a tremendous responsibility that comes with that. It's empowering, but it's a large load to bear too. To keep in mind that these are real human beings, and in some cases they're still out there, or their descendants are still out there, and so. I feel ya. I'm doing one more, and then I'm doing an epic romance.
I'm gonna watch that.
And Robbie, obviously, Watergate is a lot. There's a lot to look at. How did you sort of hone in on what?
Well, it's interesting because I kind of have the opposite problems. Right. It's like when you're looking at something like Watergate, it's been so picked over and. Kind of the boomer mythology of it. It's everybody's always like, there's been so much on Watergate. Well, there's been a very narrow telling of Watergate and that period. But in some cases, I had to really take a more impressionistic take on the research, right? So there are a lot of motivations and people are writing things a lot in Watergate, like John Dean and Mo Dean's book. They're trying to paint themselves in a certain light, and people for 50 years have been trying to paint themselves in the right light for Watergate. So you have to really go down to, you got to sift through all that and read between the lines. And the worst thing you can do, when you're doing something where it hasn't been picked over like this, you can tell how it really happened, and people are seeing it for the first time. But with Watergate, the worst thing I can do is do just a Wikipedia retelling of this shit. Nobody wants to see that, People want to see what they haven't seen before, and that's difficult to find for something like this. But fortunately, I've been a Nixon geek since I was a kid.
I think I read that, actually. I was going to ask.
Yeah, the culture Nixon around Nixon is really ground zero for a lot of the mendacity and corruption we see now, but also the culture war stuff. So, Nixon was really, on a national level, changed the culture of politics and the kind of the way we talk about politics and the business of politics in Washington. And I found my chief, since I've been a kid, I've been, reading the contemporaneous stuff. You're amazed at how dumb it all is, but in a way that everybody can relate to it. John Oliver used to call the Trump-Russia scandal stupid Watergate. But if you know anything about Watergate, Watergate is stupid Watergate, because when when you're doing crimes at the highest levels of government, you're hiring idiots, and you're hiring people who can't they can't get there the straight way, right? And ultimately, you know, what I saw and what I always knew was that these things, they start out more farcical than you think, but because they're at the top of the government, they have tragic consequences. Like if these people were running a Chick-fil-A in Houston, it would go under in a month. But they're at the highest level of federal government, and so they destroy a nation's trust in its executive branch. And you know, the mundane incompetence of the Trump administration would be really funny if I wrote it, but it leads to, you know, one thing that it leads to, for example, is losing the ledger that shows which kid matches up with which parent that they separated. And now you gotta, you know, they have really horrible consequences. And I think most people don't realize that authoritarianism and fascism starts really fun and stupid and fun for the people involved and kind of goofy to witness, and it looks harmless, but it turns bad real quick. And I really wanted to show that. So that required me going on beyond the kind of what do you call it when somebody has the priorities that John Dean has in telling his story, and the you know, how John Mitchell or Woodward and Bernstein want to tell their story, and kind of going beyond all that and just telling my truth of it. So I actually didn't feel a heavy debt of responsibility to most of those guys. I felt one to Martha Mitchell because her story's never been told before, but people always ask me if I talked to John Dean or anything like that, and I was like, I don't want to talk to that guy. I get it. I get why he did what he did. You know, he's gotten to tell his story a lot.
Well, I don't think any of your shows are Wikipedia entries. So.
Oh no, I wasn't implying.
Oh, I know, no, but I just meant.
But
like,
with
I think
history show, you know,
I think you
history
all
shows,
succeeded.
there's always this huge danger that you're just like, see, this happened.
Well, I looked at all the Wikipedias of each incident that the shows are on. None of the shows are like the Wikipedia, so it goes way beyond. I
Thanks,
think you
man.
all succeeded in that. About going back to the responsibility bit that you all touched on, I think something, you know, that comes with that is also people not always being happy with what you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that come with telling this story about real people, in addition to the emotional burden that it takes on yourselves when you're doing all the research? But just, you know, I mean, I can relate as a journalist too. You know, it's like not everyone's gonna be happy, but you're telling the story with a lens that you wanted, you felt was best for the show. So if you could, you know, touch a little bit on that. Yeah, go ahead. Anybody can start.
Yeah, so obviously it's a huge responsibility, and it varies from show to show. You know, if you have a show where there's only one victim and they're dead, that's a different thing from a show where there is a surviving victim and you have
Or the family.
or the family, yeah. And it also, I think, depends on how recent the crime is or the situation is. And I'm saying some of this because, you know, I'm thinking it is a very present front of mind thing for me, because the show that we're shooting right now, the Broberg story, you know, this, a child who was victimized and abducted and traumatized for her whole life. And so we wouldn't have and couldn't have done the show without her. So she's there on set a lot, which is a very, very intense experience. And, you know, making a show is hard, right? Like it's an intense, stressful thing. It's very fun, but it's also very hard. But all that kind of pales beside, you know, the responsibility to somebody who is seeing their life story dramatized on screen, and this is their life, and they've carried it with them, and it's a cathartic thing and a meaningful thing, and that it's just a very different thing from doing a non-true crime show.
Well, I think as long as you go into these endeavors with the specific intention that there's something that you want to say, rather than making anything sensational, or the worst you can do is be exploitative. Like there has to be a reason to tell this story, and not every story needs to be told. And hopefully, like these gentlemen, and you become discerning enough to realize when there's something that can be helpful to people, to be said, like Dr. Death, like know your rights as a patient, and how terrible the government is. So I think that's where it comes from. And then, from that, there's always going to be people who you want more. They want you to show the exploitation. They want the gore. They want the, all that. And too bad. You didn't get to tell the story. You can do it your own way. But I also think that, if people, as the reviews for our show is coming out, I also think that, if people are polarized, then I've done my job well, because I've given you something to talk about. You may not like what I had to say, but you're talking about it. I'll take that any day over just,
just
whatever, it's fine.
Likes it, fine.
Totally.
Yeah, I think that's why I don't like when people lead with this crazy thing. This is the craziest thing I've ever. Because you're right. So many stories are not every story has to be told, and not even the craziest story has to be told. I'd rather somebody tell a crazy story that they see something they want to say with it than me telling a crazy story just because it's nuts. I think a lot of there's a lot of that out there, and a lot of pressure to do that.
Yeah, I mean, at one point, someone was talking to me about doing Ted Bundy, and I said, no, to me, that's a story of a pile of women's bodies, and I'm not interested. I don't need to give this guy any more air. I don't care what drove him or anything. It's not for me. Find somebody else.
Yeah, but that takes a lot of experience in the industry to say no to that.
It's very powerful once you realize you can say no to things.
Yeah, it is.
It takes a few years, for
Well,
sure.
because
It's a new one for me, and I've
everybody
been
who
doing it
reps
for
you will be like, you'll just hear that, you'll feel it in the force. It's like this. Oh, well, we could have made something out of it. No, I agree. I would say the same thing about Ted Bundy. I'd be like, well, what am I going to talk about that's interesting, to me?
Well, I was just telling some of you that I saw that Lifetime greenlit the Gabby Petito death case, which is not.
I got pitched that.
Oh.
Me too.
Everybody.
Wow.
Yeah, execs just when that was out, execs were like, Gabby Petito. You want to do Gabby Petito?
That's the horrible thing now. Anytime, and every week there's a new horrible story that we're tracking for a couple days, and then it becomes a thing for us and anybody else who's done a true crime show. You're getting pitched the story, and every week the agencies put out this available material, available for option thing, and it's the latest New York Magazine story or the latest Atlantic, whatever it is. Most of them I think are not right for adaptation, right? That's the
especially as a TV show.
It's also, and the counterpoint to or corollary to what you were saying about this is the craziest story thing is. There's a follow-up question to that. It's well, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. And it's okay, but what's the human story underneath it? I am interested in a story that's this is the craziest thing you've ever heard, if when you get under the surface, there's something kind of fundamentally relatable in it, right? So you start going those people are really different from me. I could never be in that situation. And then when you dig a little deeper, you're oh my God, I see how they got there.
Yeah, I think the execs think a lot of times, it's not all execs, but I think a lot of times when you're pitched the Gabby Petito thing, they just think there's like an underestimation of the audience. Like the audience is going to know if you care about what you're writing about, and the audience is going to know if you're exploring a question that means something, and if you're searching for some answer. You're an artist, and you're not just a journalist, you know. I love journalists, but
okay.
you know what I'm saying. You're not just. But you're searching for. Why not just do a documentary about it? Like you're searching for something that you can only uncover through your specific digging through this story, you know?
Yeah, whether you get there or not, you're looking for like a deeper emotional truth. And to me, it's always like when we go into these true crime stories, I think about like, Boys Don't Cry, or Heavenly Creatures, or Badlands, or these things that are based on real things that got to some kind of powerful human experience. And that, whether we get there or not, that's what I think the goal is for me.
Yeah, I think, Amelia got me, Amelia's our friend who's a novelist, but she got me very into Joyce Carol Oates and and Blonde and Zombie, which is
Dahmer story.
Yeah, but she's not even close to the truth of those situations a lot of times, but or the facts, but she's so close to the truth. She's showing you a truth that you couldn't see through anybody else but her, or you feel like you couldn't see it through anybody else but her. And I think that's the best true crime stuff. That's the best. But like you say, with the TV show, you got 8 episodes, so you better have something big that you're exploring.
Right. That to me is why it can't just be about the facts or like the delivery of information. It has to be about what was it like to live through this. It was an experience.
And sometimes some things are too fresh to be able to explore that. It sounds like what everyone's saying. Well,
Definitely.
did you want to add anything before I throw it to the audience for any questions?
I mean, the only thing that I'll add, because I think Girl from Plainville is probably the most recent of all of these stories, and we were definitely facing that every single day. So we were facing that part, and then we were also facing the fact that we were tackling a story that very well could be triggering in a very real way, and that sort of hung over us the entire 2 years, that from beginning to end, and by the way, up into the edit. I mean, I'll be honest, we were having really difficult conversations in the edit, which is not where you want to have these difficult conversations, quite frankly, about what we were doing. Were we doing it responsibly? And we genuinely felt from the very beginning that we were. We felt like Liz and I, in our very first meeting over coffee on La Brea, neither she nor I have ever had writing partners, like formal partners. And that can be a very combustible relationship, potentially, if you've never done that before. And we just sort of saw eye to eye from the very beginning about, the first 10 minutes we talked about the fact that we can't sensationalize this. And there really is, I don't want to throw people under the bus, but like sometimes there's a push to sensationalize something. Like the people who want to make it, sometimes and I'm not saying that they did it on Girl from Plainville, I'm not saying they did it on Dr. Death or any of your shows, but like in general, is the audience going to be hooked by this? And Liz and I were adamant that, just with each other, not with anybody else, that we needed to ensure that we were presenting this story truthfully, at least our truth of it, honestly, at least the honesty that we took out of the material, and that there would never be a point in time where anybody could ever point to our show and say that we were trying to sensationalize that story, because to be frank, it's a dangerous story. On lots and lots of levels, it's really, really dangerous. And we had great support from various foundations that helped us out with mental health foundations and suicide prevention foundations and national eating disorder, right? So we had lots of guidance, but at the end of the day, how people took that could potentially go bad. And I'll be honest with you, whatever accolades come our way, if they should, The thing that Liz and I have talked about in the last month and a half or so that we were most proud of is the fact that the people who were reviewing the show were saying they did not sensationalize the story. And the fact that that was like in the first 10 minutes of our first meeting in 2019, that's a huge win, and it's a bigger win than any awards that we could ever possibly get, because I'll just say one final thing, which is that one of the things that came to me when I did Dr. Death was that we created these social action campaigns. Dr. Death is the For the Patients campaign. Girl from Plainville is Let's Talk. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know when I first signed on to Dr. Death that we were going to do anything like that. I didn't know that patient safety, again, I'm ignorant. I didn't know that patient safety was an issue, quite frankly. And so, there was a greater good that eventually came out of both of these shows that furthers the conversation way beyond entertainment and way beyond sensationalizing it. And so that is as a company, as my company, that's something that we're more proud of than anything else. You can keep all your viewers. The fact that we got to create something that could potentially do a greater good for the world is, I don't know, it's a win. So as I transition out of true crime, I'm very proud of what we did as a group.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you guys so much. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions from anybody. I think you guys can just, I'll call on you. Go ahead.
Do you think that true crime is more likely to get a series order because it's already kind of established in in the culture?
That's a good question. I don't think so now because it's so saturated, but what do you think?
Yeah, I would say because there's just this huge wave of true crime right now. In the sales world, people tend to then back off a bit, but there is the attractive thing about it in that they know the story that you're going to tell, so it's not as big of a gamble as crafting from whole cloth, which I'll have to do again one day, which sounds terrifying. But there's a comfort for studios, networks in knowing what they're buying. But I also think that there's a cyclical nature to the business, and I think we're probably pretty much at the zenith of true crime right now. And it'll circle back again, but you just gotta wait for it to go.
You
around
shouldn't
again.
try to time the market. That's when I first got to LA. It was hey, R-rated comedies are out, man. Tomcats did terrible or something, And then they come back around, and everybody's they're great again, and then they, I don't know. If you love the thing, that's what's gonna get people excited.
Yeah, I mean that's true. You can never really. We were joking in the car on the way over here that at the beginning of the pandemic, Ted Lasso came out, and everybody's just this is all we want. We want feel good stuff.
Yeah,
this is all we want. And then it's boom, Squid Game, biggest thing ever. So it's
That is not feel good.
Yeah.
Great. Sure.
Hey guys, you already touched on this a bit, the responsibility, but I wondered if you could talk about the conflict sometimes between entertainment and truth. Because I think about things like Pam and Tommy and Winning Time recently, where they're fun shows, but I sometimes feel like they're simplifying characters for the beats of the story. And do you ever have those decisions to make where you're if we do it this way or show this character to be like this, it'll be more entertaining, but it might take away from the truth?
Yeah, I mean, we had a little bit of the opposite problem with Candy in that John Crowder, her lawyer, was so bombastic and crazy that they were constantly just this doesn't feel real. I'm oh, it's real. He did that. But yeah, I mean, it's always going to come down to the relationship of the story and the creator and the audience, in that I trust that every creator out there is just doing it the way that they believe in, and there's no universal taste for something. Some people will get it and love it, and other people just no. And everybody's right, because it's a very personal thing.
Yeah, and I would just, in a universal sense, add to that, if you were doing this, if you're taking a complicated true story, especially if you have a ton of research, you will have to condense stuff. You will have to combine some characters. So it's about being judicious and trying to kind of stay in the zone of what is the deeper truth of the story that you're telling. and how can we preserve or even emphasize that by combining these two characters or condensing these two events, or this thing that happened 7 times over 4 years. We can't just show it 7 times. We have to, show it as 1 or 2 incidents. You always have to make those decisions. So it's just a part of the process about how you do it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that my touchstone is always, I heard an interview on Terry Gross with Peter Morgan, who did The Crown. And his quote, which I repeat all the time, and I always give him credit for it because it's brilliant, is that we're portraitists, we're not photographers. It's not a documentary. We're painting a landscape. That's based on something that's real and in front of us. But if you want the no embellishment, just truth of it, then find a documentary.
Yeah, Werner Herzog calls it the ecstatic truth. That's your filiality should be to that and not the facts. Because when you say truth, it's like that's a different thing than the facts.
Okay, we'll go way back there in the middle.
So going back to the beginning, my mother was British, and for my Nana's 90th birthday, she gave her the 100 most famous murders in the world, in history. And I was like, why did you do that? And then my uncle said to me, well, they're British, and the British love, murder mysteries. I mean, Shakespeare, and he started to label, name all these things, and going back to like Greek tragedy. So in a way, I feel like we kind of like are putting this into a current context, but really, when you think of it like long term, they've been, artists have been doing this forever. So I'm just curious as to when you get offered a certain story, because like, okay, for Elephant, which was made about, the Columbine murders, was then fictionalized. Do you come to a point where you go, no, we're going to really tell this story, or maybe we need to fictionalize it somewhat? I mean, I just feel like there's that divide where, King Richard, was written about King Richard, but of course he, took license with it, right? So where in that point do you ever say to yourself, no, we're going to do this and we're going to try and make this truly, match reality, or should we take this and make it into actually a fictionalized version of this story?
Well, first I want to know what the #1 most famous murder was in history.
At that time it was Jack the Ripper, believe it or not.
Of course, fair.
This was in the 80s, yeah.
Yeah.
We should have played that game. Like, name it. Shit.
We need that book.
By the way, you mentioned Elephant. I just want to say I didn't realize until recently that Elephant was based on a British film that's like a 40-minute. Do you know this? It's on YouTube or it's online. Somebody showed it to me recently as a reference for something that we're shooting in the Friend of the Family. But I watched this. It's a really interesting short film.
They just show IRA killings.
Yeah.
But, as they really happen, and they're very quiet.
Yeah, it's just the most kind of minimalist. It's like.
I just saw it in Cannes and remember thinking, how did you why did you make it into a fiction? But maybe I was misunderstanding where it came from.
No, totally. That actually, it is applicable to your question still, of course, but I actually would really like to do what you just suggested the next time out, or the next time that I am presented with a real story that's compelling, just because, like you were saying, it's been so exhausting to deal with, the real truth of it. But I don't know. I mean, I never considered doing that.
P.T.
with
Anderson
Bars.
does with The Master, with Boogie Nights. He does it a lot. We've talked about that a lot too. One of the things that I think hinders that a little in TV is a little bit of the commercial. Like they do want it. So if you're doing a story like that, they're not gonna. They want it to be based on something real. And so I feel like it's a hard sell to be like, oh, we're gonna do candy, but it's gonna. I feel like the execs wouldn't be able to wrap their minds around.
Well, and there's pitfalls there too. That the dangers of exploitation too. I did a season on Law and Order SVU, And Law and Order's bread and butter is ripped from the headlines, you know, but it gets extremely complicated when you get into SVU because you have these stories that everyone knows, but they want you to change it just enough so that you know who we're talking about, but they don't have to pay them for their rights or anything. And it's just kind of gross, you know? So it's its own form of exploitation if you're not careful. So it's not, you know, like the escape hatch that makes you, you know, free from guilt. It's just a different one.
I actually have, weirdly, a week ago experience with this because, and the project will go unnamed because I don't think it would be appropriate for me to do so. But my company was developing this real life true crime story that took place overseas, and everybody out there agreed it would make an amazing story, but it's overseas, so why don't you fictionalize it and put it in the United States? And I said no. I had the exact opposite. I said, this is a story that is about this culture. It is a story that is about this country, these people, their background, and me transplanting it from X to Detroit is not telling the story the way that it's supposed to be told. And again, I'm not slighting anyone for their opinions on it, but it's very strange you asked this question because I had to face it last week where I passed and just said, it's okay, we're gonna release it and let it go back because it's such a great story, but it deserves to be told overseas. So yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Oh no.
Or like 14 more.
I'm sorry. Can someone else on the panel?
No, this is you. You have to do this.
Okay. Can I do eeny, meeny, miny, mo or something? Okay. I think you had 1, 2, 3. I think.
What if we swear that we'll keep our answers short?
Okay, yeah. We'll do the last two up in the back. So okay, first go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. I feel like I won an award.
You got one before
just
me.
my
God damn
anxiety
it.
award.
I apologize in advance. It's a two-parter, and I want to talk a little bit about cheating.
Oh no. Oh no.
Rights acquisitions. So I want to just briefly touch on the legal aspect of it, of securing someone's life rights. But also, I want you to hear a little bit about the humanity of that, where you are literally sitting and talking to a victim, a neighbor, a family member, and pitching yourself as the author of their story.
Only one of us gets to go, so Robin.
I haven't
Go
done
ahead.
this, so anybody who's actually done this.
You've done life rights. Go ahead.
This is a very complicated and fraught thing because in some cases with these things, you're not getting people's life rights. You're getting the rights to an article that somebody else wrote about them or a book that somebody else wrote about them, or it's in the public domain and you can tell. So it really depends on the project. And it goes back to what I was saying before about the responsibility to the surviving people. You know, like I said, a friend of the family, it's like we're like, we cannot do this story unless we go to them and make our case for why we want to tell this story, how we're going to treat it, and what their involvement is going to be, and talk to Jan herself about this. And so then, because the rights were tied up in the documentary, and it was sort of a complicated thing, it took, I don't know, like 1.5 years or something to kind of iron that out. But it's, yeah, I don't really know how to answer that question in a global way. It's very, very project specific, and you know, you have to kind of.
How do you prepare a pitch when you're pitching yourself? You're not pitching the subject. You know, they know the story. It's their story.
Yeah.
Pitch
So,
yourself to tell their story.
I would not describe it as a pitch. It's a very different thing from pitching a studio network. Yeah, the conversation. You know, I think you just have to be as open and honest as you can about what your intentions are, and what your process is going to be, and you know, be prepared to hear a no and respect that. I think, and I learned a little by osmosis for this from Erin Lee Carr, who, is involved with Girl from Plainville, who is a documentary filmmaker and, has just incredible experience and empathy with the subjects of traumatic experiences. And I think you just have to go, I can only speak really to approaching the Broberg family and just, ask how they're doing and learn about them and learn if they're going to be okay with what you want to do with the story. And yeah.
See, this is why you should do shows about lying politicians and deviant televangelists, because you don't feel a responsibility to any of those motherfuckers.
Yeah, I would say, the Broberg story is a really clear-cut one. There's other stories where it's like, you kind of know that the subject of the story might not be okay with how the story is being told, and your responsibility is not necessarily to somebody who killed somebody.
And I know we said only one, but I will also say, like, having on Dr. Death, for instance, we absolutely were talking to the victims, right, to the patients. And Josh Jackson, who is just spectacular in that show, he talks about it often, about the fact that he, who was playing the guy that did this to these people, really felt an insane amount of responsibility to ensure that we, as a group, were not sensationalizing their story. And something that he said is really bang on, which is, it's so important when you're doing these things that you don't come off as an opportunist. And that isn't strategy. That's just be a human and understand what you're doing. And when you ask them, how are you doing? And when you ask them about their lives, mean it. Like, it's not that you're going out just to absorb this story and make money off of it, but you understand that again, you don't owe them the responsibility to tell the story from their perspective or that puts them in the best light, but ensure that you're talking to these people as humans, because that's what they are. I mean, we had similar with Conrad's mom, like Lynn Roy. The first time she called me, I was doing press on Dr. Death, and she and I spoke for an hour and a half. And it really wasn't about the show. It was about life. And it was a great conversation that had nothing to do with our show. And being able to build that sense of trust and mean it is vital, not just to your creative process, but it's vital to just being a good person and actually meaning it when you say, how are you doing? So, sorry, that's a bit of a soapbox, but it is like you get overwhelmed by these stories sometimes, and you don't know how to feel your way out. And the best answer to feeling your way out is to just be a human that cares.
Okay, last question in the back. Sorry.
So I feel like there's a huge dichotomy between, especially the recent abundance of shows and movies about women who kill versus the reality of like that most killers are men and most victims are women. How do you guys like deal with this conflict, and what do you think this obsession is recently with like women who are driven to kill?
To be perfectly honest, I think there's a twofold thing going on here. There is a true drive for more female-centric storytelling and female-led content, and also people love violence. They want to see it, and so they kind of go hand in hand. And I think that's probably the basest answer to that question, but probably the honest one. And I've spoken about this with other women writers and directors and everything. It's the representation is great, love it, that we're out there and everything. But I also feel like some of us have reached a point where like I'd rather see a woman murder a man than a man murder a woman at this point. That's just my personal taste. Like I'm just not gonna do it, Women murdering each other, fine. Women murdering men, good. Men murdering women, nah, someone else,
Well said. So good.
I don't think we can top that answer. Thank you guys so much, and thank you all for coming. And it was really great chatting with you.
Thank you all very much.
Oh, and I believe there's the candy screening. So if you're around and have a ticket, you should go check it out. I don't know if it's here. It's
Does anybody know where we're
SeriesFest.
going?
It's in here. Okay, yeah. So check it out. Oh, it's next. Oh, I think you should stick around.
Thank you again, everybody.
Thank